So today, so today I want to speak about Helen Keller. Most likely, the image that you have or that comes to mind when we speak about Helen Keller is of a young, blind, and deaf Helen at the water pump with her teacher, Annie Sullivan, running their hands under the water as the teacher rapidly spells out the word water in sign language as the young Helen feels her hands and begins to connect in her mind how Anne's hands feel with the sensation of water, something that she had felt all of her life, something that she had partaken of. She's obviously had water. She'd taken a bath. She'd had a glass of water, many, but she had no idea what to call it. We all know that scene and the drama of it, the joy of it. It's one of the most feel-good moments in American theater and cinema. It's an iconic moment. It's a moment of the triumph of the human spirit. And we all know from what we learned in school how Helen Keller became one of the most beloved people, not only in America, but around the world, and as a symbol of the triumph of a symbol of triumph over adversity. She's held up not only as an example for people who are differently abled, but as an example to people, especially children, as an example of how individuals can achieve whatever they need or want to if they just work hard enough and not give up. We all heard things like, if Helen Keller can achieve so much and she was blind and deaf, then you can master your multiplication tables, Johnny. Or, yes, being born with no arms is a terrible thing, Janie, but just look at what Helen Keller did. I'm going to touch on that idea a little bit more later on. Helen Keller was born 141 years ago today, on June 27th in 1880. And the life that she led and the example she set for us are worth remembering and celebrating. But that life and that example go far beyond what most people ever learn about in school, and well beyond the image of a differently abled person triumphing over any physical challenge they may have. And it's what lies beyond those usual things that we were taught, and which most children are still taught in school even today in 2021, that I want to talk about today. But first, yes, a little bit of background. As I mentioned, Helen was born in 1880 in Tuscumbia, Alabama. Her father, Arthur Henley Keller, he spent many years as an editor of the Tuscumbia North Alabamian, and he had served as a captain in the Confederate Army. The family were part of the slaveholding elite before the Civil War, but they lost that status later on. Her mother, Catherine Everett Keller, was descended from the Unitarian minister Edward Everett Hale, but the Kellers were not Unitarians. Helen herself would later become a Swedenborgian when she was given pamphlets to read as a young woman by her friend Alexander Graham Bell, who was Unitarian, and I might talk a little bit more about that later on. At 19 months old, Helen contracted what some say was scarlet fever, others say it was a form of meningitis which left her both blind and deaf. As she grew, she was able to communicate somewhat with a young girl named Martha Washington, who was 2 years older than her, who was the daughter of the family cook, and who understood the hand signs that Helen had devised. By the age of 7, Helen had more than 60 home signs that she made, her own kind of signs, to communicate with her family. And she could distinguish people by the vibrations of their walking on the floor. Eventually, her mother learned about the work that Alexander Graham Bell was doing with deaf children at the time, and she sent her husband and Helen off to seek his advice. And he recommended that they go to the Perkins School for the Blind in South Boston, where the director, Michael Anagnos, asked the then 20-year-old Anne Sullivan, who was also visually impaired and who had also graduated from the school. He asked if she would be Helen's instructor. So Anne Sullivan arrived at the Keller home on March 5th in 1887, and Helen would later write that it was a day she would forever remember as my soul's birthday. Sullivan would remain her teacher and later her companion for the next 50 years. And you all know then from the stories we've heard and read and seen how things developed after that. The difficulties at first of trying to teach Helen, the petulance of Helen's father and his impatience with Anne Sullivan and with Helen, and then the breakthrough as Helen realized that all things have a name. That work with Anne Sullivan eventually led to Helen applying to, and after a lot of back and forth with the school and with the leaders of the school who tried to discourage her, not because she was blind and deaf, but that was unspoken. But they kept telling her, well, you know, this isn't really a place for women. Well, she finally got in, and she graduated as a member of Phi Beta Kappa, and she received her BA cum laude from Radcliffe College. And if you recall the stories that we learned of her, or if you've read her autobiography, Light in My Darkness, you'll know how she became an international sensation, a celebrity. The fact is that she was really exploited by the media to sell papers and by others who sought to cash in on her achievements and her fame, and also on her being differently abled. She often received requests to appear as part of a vaudeville act. Can you imagine? Part of a vaudeville act, or to appear on stage in front of people. And they offered to pay her a lot of money, but she never accepted those. Helen was much more than her blindness and her deafness. As she matured, she began to think and inquire about the same things that most thoughtful human beings think about. Who am I? What am I? What's the meaning in life? Is there a God? And if there is, who is he or she? What is truth? Why is there evil in the world if God is all loving? Is there a heaven and a hell? What happens when we die? Why are there such things as sickness and poverty and war and racism? She was a voracious reader of anything that she could find in Braille or that Sullivan would spell out in her hands. Anne Sullivan, think about how hard that work was. Every book that had to be read by a student at Radcliffe, for example, Anne Sullivan had to spell every single word out in Helen's hands. Every paper that Helen had to write, every test she had to take, Anne Sullivan had to spell everything out in her hands and write down her answers. And so Helen became a voracious reader. In fact, there is a picture of Helen Keller standing there with a Braille copy. I forget what book she's holding, but these were very large books. And her entire library is filled with these gigantic books, all in Braille. Eventually, during the course of her studies, she read Karl Marx and the writings and lectures of prominent American and European socialists like Eugene Debs and H.G. Wells and others. She became a member of the Socialist Party, but finding eventually even the socialists were too slow for her, she joined the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World, an international labor union that seeks to unite all unions and act both politically and with direct action as the means to bring about economic and political equity throughout the world. Let me read to you a portion of an interview she gave to the New York Tribune on January 15th, 1916, during World War I. She said, "It is my nature to fight as soon as I see wrongs to be made right. So after I read Wells and Marx and learned what I did, I joined the socialists. I made up my mind to do something, and the best thing seemed to be to join a fighting party and help them. That was 4 years ago. I have become an industrialist since." The interviewer says, "An industrialist? You don't mean IWW, a syndicalist?" She said, "I became IWW because I found out the Socialist Party was too slow. It is sinking into the political bog. It is almost, if not quite impossible, for the party to keep its revolutionary character so long as it occupies a place under the government and seeks office under it. The government does not stand for the interests of the Socialist Party that it's supposed the interests the Socialist Party is supposed to represent. Socialism, however, she said, is a step in the right direction. The true task is to unite all organized workers on an economic basis, and it's the workers themselves who must secure freedom for themselves, who must grow strong. Nothing can be gained by political action, she said. That is why I became IWW. And then they asked her what possessed her to join the IWW, and she said the Lawrence strike, referring to the Lawrence textile strike, also known as the Bread and Roses strike that occurred in 1912. And then they said to her, what are you committed to, education or revolution? And her response was, revolution. She answered directly, we can't have education without revolution. We've tried peace education for 1900 years and it has failed. Let us try revolution and see what happens now. And so naturally, statements like these by her burst that bubble that the public had of that gilded eternal child that the media portrayed and that the public wanted to believe and to use as that penultimate feel-good story. And ironically, this construction of the iconic or mythological Helen Keller has resulted in numerous books about her life, written by individuals who are differently abled, who recount growing up feeling deeply resentful of her. They saw Keller as an impossibly perfect individual who personally overcame all limitations in order to become a world famous figure, someone who pulled herself up by her bootstraps, so to speak, and did so with a polite smile. In reality, those books, those narratives really contradict the experience of the vast majority of differently abled people today, then and now, who endure incredibly high rates of poverty and homelessness, discrimination, police brutality, and ostracism, even today in 2021. Helen Keller fought her entire life against the bigoted notions and the distortions of her own life story. She constantly combated attempts to render her some sort of icon. Still, those images regarding Helen continue to be reinforced everywhere today. They can be found in primary school books still, and in the vast majority of books about her, even adult biographies of her. And more often than not, her radical politics and her deeply spiritual beliefs are simply ignored. They don't talk about them. But even when they are acknowledged, it's usually in order to discount them, as if somehow differently abled people, especially one so challenged as Helen Keller, couldn't possibly really understand all the complexities of the human condition. Newspaper editors, for example, would use her physical challenges as a means to dismiss her politics and to dissuade people from listening to her or taking her seriously. Her radicalism, conservative writers would say, was, quote, a product of the political mistakes which spring out of the manifest limitations of her development. In other words, she didn't have the brains to really know what she was talking about because she was blind and deaf. That's really what they were saying. Here's what the Detroit Free Press wrote about her in 1914. As long as Miss Keller appears before the public in the light of a member of society, struggling nobly under the great handicaps and furnishing by her example inspiration for others who are unfortunately placed, she does a valuable work. But the moment she undertakes to speak ex cathedra, as it were, that means with authority in a Catholic term, as it were, of all the political and social problems of the day, she receives a consideration out of all proportion to her fund of knowledge and judgment. Helen Keller, struggling to point the way to the light for the deaf, dumb, and blind, is inspiring. Helen Keller preaching socialism. Helen Keller passing on the merits of the copper strike. Helen Keller sneering at the Constitution of the United States. Helen Keller, under these aspects, is pitiful. She is beyond her depth. She speaks with the handicap of limitation, which no amount of determination or science can overcome. Her knowledge is and must be almost purely theoretical, and unfortunately, this world and its problems are both very practical. One newspaper began its editorial about her with this sentence: "It would be difficult to imagine anything more pathetic than the present exploitation of poor Helen Keller by the socialists." To which Helen replied this. She said, in a speech, she said, "I do not like the hypocritical sympathy of such a paper, but I am glad if it knows what the word exploitation means." Helen Keller knew sarcasm. What's remarkable, though, is the power and the tenacity that she brought to bear in answering these attacks. She courageously defied any and all attempts to render her a second class citizen. She would have her say, and nobody was going to stop her. Gradually, her interest grew in studying the specific conditions of people, of differently abled people in the United States. And it led her to draw conclusions about society that dovetailed with those conditions. She noticed that the leading cause of disability in the United States were largely then attributable to industrial and workplace accidents and diseases frequently caused by an employer's greed and the reluctance to prioritize workers' safety over their profits. She found that other social factors contributed too, like the prevalence of poverty, unequal access to medicine, overcrowded and unsanitary slums, and an officially imposed societal ignorance regarding matters of reproductive and sexual health. She discovered that once disabled, who were disabled because of those conditions, such individuals constituted a class who, quote, are as a rule are poor, cast aside, and forgotten. They were thrown into institutions. They were mired in poverty and unemployment. They were cut off from educational opportunities, and they were segregated and marginalized at every turn. There was not a single census taken back then in any state or city of the country that even kept track of the numbers and the needs of the disabled population. And they simply didn't exist as far as the powers that be were concerned. They just turned another eye. And I think many of us who grew up in the past 50 years or so, I can remember walking along the street and seeing people begging who were differently abled. And my mother sort of just hurrying me along. You don't want to see that. You don't want to, don't stare. That was always, don't stare, which really meant don't look, because they were shoved aside. We didn't want to see them. In 1912, Helen Keller wrote this. She said, "Step by step, my investigation of blindness led me into the industrial world." And what a world it is. How different from the world of my beliefs. I must unflinchingly face a world of facts, a world of misery, degradation, blindness, a world struggling against the elements, against the unknown, against itself. How to reconcile this world of fact with the bright world of my own imagining? My darkness had been filled with the light of intelligence, and behold, the outer day-lit world was stumbling and groping in social blindness. For a time, I was depressed, she told the New York Times in 1916, but little by little, my confidence came back, and I realized that the wonder is not that conditions are so bad, but that humanity has advanced so far in spite of them. And now I am in the fight to change things. I may be a dreamer, but dreamers are necessary to make facts. And in a very widely circulated interview with the New York Tribune in 1916, she stated, "I feel like Joan of Arc at times. My whole being becomes uplifted. I too hear the voices that say, 'Come,' and I will follow no matter what the cost, no matter what the trials I am placed under. Jail, poverty, calumny, they matter not. Truly," he said, meaning Jesus, Woe unto you that permit the least of mine to suffer. That comparison with Joan of Arc that she made was very deliberate. She considered herself driven by spiritual as well as worldly imperatives. And so often she infused a version of Christian socialism into her Marxist politics and activism. Her specific denomination, as I mentioned earlier, was Swedenborgian, a sect of Christianity that sees the Bible as allegory rather than history, and that defied church hierarchy and dogma and sought to better humanity's condition while at the same time believing in the immortality and universality of the soul. It was founded by the Swedish mystic and scientist Emanuel Swedenborg back in the 1600s. And she found that this particular faith enabled her to see that I could use the Bible, which has so baffled me, as an instrument for digging out precious truths, just as I could use my hindered, halting body for the high behests of my spirit. The interesting connection there for us as Unitarians and Universalists is that many Unitarians and many Universalists back then were attracted to Swedenborgianism. And in fact, there were Unitarian Swedenborgians early on in the 17 and 1800s and in the early part of the 20th century, believing that the essence of the gospel was the supreme and equal worth of each individual soul. Let me repeat that: the supreme and equal worth of each individual soul. She insisted there is no peace between the teachings of Christ and any form of slavery. That comment about the worth of every individual soul is what our first principle is based on. It wasn't uncommon for her to pepper her lectures and writings on social disease and disability with a lot of references. She would quote verses like Isaiah 65:22. God is fulfilling his promise of a day when men shall build houses and inhabit them, shall plant vineyards and enjoy the fruits of them. They shall not build and another inhabit. They shall not plant and another eat. They shall enjoy the work of their own hands. She often referred to Jesus as him who stood with the oppressed and the defrauded. And she had no use for those who would use religion to bolster the status quo. She believed that faith is a mockery if it does not teach us that we can build a world, both material and spiritual, more complete than the world is today. In short, she had come to conclude that our worst foes are ignorance, poverty, and the unconscious cruelty of our commercial society. These are the causes of blindness. These are the enemies which destroy the sight of children and workmen and undermine the health of mankind. A final factor that really pushed her to publicly commit to the socialist movement is political, but pretty important, less political, but pretty important. In 1908, she wrote a thesis, a treatise entitled The World I Live In. And she felt that if she were to be taken seriously by society in the assertion of her right as a full human being to discuss the affairs of that society, she had to mount a defense against her detractors. So she wrote this book. She says, scientific men think I can know very little about objects, even a few feet beyond the reach of my arms. Everything outside of myself, according to them, is a hazy blur. Trees, mountains, cities, the ocean, even the house I live in are but fairy fabrications, misty unrealities. Ideas make the world we live in, and impressions furnish ideas. My world is built of touch sensations, devoid of physical color and sound, but without color and sound, it throbs with life. Every object is associated in my mind with tactual qualities, which, combined in countless ways, give me a sense of power, of beauty, or of incongruity. It is not for me to say whether we see best with the hand or the eye. I only know that the world I see with my fingers is alive, ruddy, and satisfying. The colors that glorify my world, the blue of the sky, the green of the fields, may not correspond exactly with those you delight in, but they are nonetheless color to me. The sun does not shine from my physical eyes, nor does the lightning flash, nor do the trees turn green in the spring, but they have not therefore ceased to exist, any more than the landscape is annihilated when you turn your back on it. Between my experience and the experience of others, there is no gulf of mute space which I may not bridge. Helen was friends with some of the most important voices, political, religious people, and others, including people like Charlie Chaplin, Emma Goldman, Eugene Debs, and other prominent socialists and IWW leaders. We often see a picture of her on her autobiography of her sitting at her desk daintily sniffing a rose. And instead of maybe seeing that picture, they should show her carrying a big red flag. She supported Margaret Sanger and her birth control clinics, and later on she would distance herself, though, from Sanger's ideas about eugenics, the idea that the purpose of science is to develop a perfect race. She championed the rights of African Americans, and she felt a strong sense of shame over her Southern heritage, which included lynchings and slavery and segregation. And she was an early supporter of the uh, newly created NAACP. She helped to found the ACLU in 1920. Wherever she went, she drew attention. And she knew it. And she used it to her own advantage. You know, she's sort of like, in this way, not unlike some celebrities today. It reminds you of Princess Diana, who once said, because of her work with the landmines, she said, "Wherever I go, there will be cameras. I may as well put it to good use." That's what Princess Diana said. In her writings and her speeches, Helen called for revolution rather than reform. She had no patience for compromise, and she argued that charitable aid did more to assuage the guilt of the prosperous than to improve the conditions of vulnerable people's lives. Instead, she called for the dismantling of an economic order in which the working class lives in want while the master class lives in slavery. Still, despite all of these activities, she's still remembered more commonly for her fundraising advocacy and the work she did on behalf of the American Federation for the Blind, which is really a largely apolitical organization. In fact, her leftist sympathies occasionally ruffled the feathers of the leaders of that organization. And it also made her a target for FBI surveillance for most of her life. She still continued to support socialist leaders, even in the midst of Cold War McCarthyism. Helen Keller continued her work and her fight to improve conditions for all people up until her death on June 1st, 1968. And I've only been able to touch a little bit on some of her work and accomplishments. She really, truly is a remarkable person. And I'd encourage you to read on your own about this woman who, even though she wasn't a Unitarian Universalist, she exemplifies in so many ways. And she lived out in her life what our liberal religious tradition believes. Let me close with something that started at the beginning, from a quote from the very first public lecture she gave in 1913. She said, "I am going to try to make you feel that no one of us can do anything alone, that we are bound together. I do not like this world as it is. I am trying to make it a little more as I would like to have it. It was the hands of others that made me. Without my teacher, I should be nothing. Without you, I should be nothing. We live by and for each other. We are all blind and deaf until our eyes are open to our fellow men. If we had penetrating vision, we would not endure what we see in the world today. The lands, the life, the machinery belong to the few. All the work they do gains for the workers a mere livelihood. It is the labor of the poor and ignorant that makes others refined and comfortable. It is strange that we do not see it, and that when we do not accept the conditions. But I am no pessimist. The pessimist says that man was born in darkness and for death. I believe that man was intended for the light and shall not die. It is a good world, and it will be a much better world when you help me make it more as I want it. May it be so.
If you enjoyed this video, please like us on YouTube, subscribe to our channel, and click on the bell to be notified whenever we post a new video.